Ladies and gentlemen, there are moments in life when the human mind, after years of navigating complexity, stops not because it is overwhelmed, but because it has finally found a quiet truth that does not need to be forced, argued, or engineered. A truth that arrives like a silent smile, unexpected, uncomplicated, and yet profoundly stabilizing. And it's often in these moments, the ones we least prepare for, that we discover something about ourselves that no machine, no formula, no frontier of technology ever managed to reveal. When I think about identity, not the technological identity we craft through innovation, but the emotional identity that shapes who we are at our core, I realize how deeply interconnected our internal world is with the people who quietly influence it. For years, I have spoken about rockets, neural systems, electric grids, planetary futures, and the architecture of intelligence. I have spoken about human cognition, about the underlying neural patterns that govern resilience, creativity, and decision-making. But behind all of that, behind every breakthrough, there is a psychological ecosystem that rarely gets discussed, the people who restore equilibrium when the world feels chaotic, the ones who remind us that even the most analytical minds are still wired for connection. You see, the human brain responds to emotional safety faster than it responds to logic. Neuroscience tells us that long before the prefrontal cortex formulates a strategy, the limbic system is already deciding whether we feel secure enough to think clearly. That's why the most brilliant ideas often emerge not in the midst of noise, but in the company of someone whose presence quiets the internal storm. And for a long time, I tried solving every challenge through endurance, through sheer cognitive force, believing that if I just worked harder, slept less, focused more, I could outthink emotional turbulence. But the brain does not negotiate with stress that way. It needs grounding, not resistance. It needs connection, not isolation. There came a point when I had to confront a simple truth. Even the strongest minds reach their limits when they operate without emotional oxygen. And that oxygen sometimes arrives in the form of one human being, someone whose influence is not loud, not public, not dramatic, but subtle, someone whose identity becomes woven into your ability to stay centered. And for me, her presence emerged long before I recognized its full significance. The irony is that she never asked to be part of anything extraordinary. She never sought attention, never demanded acknowledgement, never wanted her name attached to the gravitational storms of innovation. Instead, she occupied a different space, the quiet space that exists behind the curtain of ambition, where genuine connection doesn't need an audience. When I saw her, really saw her, it wasn't in the way the world expects monumental discoveries to unfold. It wasn't during some grand moment, or at the peak of some triumph. It was during the kind of instant most people overlook, the kind your brain records without announcing it. There is a phenomenon in neuroscience called micro-recognition, an unconscious identification of emotional alignment. Before you understand why someone matters, your neural patterns have already responded to them. A single interaction, a fleeting gesture, a brief exchange can trigger a stabilizing effect on your internal state. What fascinated me, and what humbled me, was realizing how often this happens long before the conscious mind catches up. For years, my life was defined by acceleration, accelerating innovation, accelerating timelines, accelerating expectations. I became familiar with the kind of pressure that reshapes even the most disciplined mind. But she moved in the opposite rhythm. Not slow, not detached, just grounded. And when you're surrounded by relentless momentum, grounding feels like gravity finding you again. She wasn't a distraction. She was calibration. I remember one particular night when everything felt like it was stacked against logic, deadlines collapsing into each other, data contradicting projections, the usual orchestration of chaos that comes with pushing the boundaries of possibility. And yet she said nothing. She didn't attempt to solve the problem, didn't offer a strategic angle, didn't try to make the moment easier with empty reassurance. She simply existed in the room with a calmness that my nervous system mirrored before I even understood what was happening. The brain does that. It regulates. It synchronizes with steady emotional frequencies when it trusts the source. And in that moment, the chaos felt less catastrophic. Her identity, if I were to describe it, is not tied to a profession or a title. It's tied to her effect. The way she changes the temperature of a room, not by entering loudly but by bringing clarity where confusion once lived. There is an elegance and restraint that few people truly understand. She understands it effortlessly, and that understanding has shaped more of my inner world than I ever intended to admit. But the reason I speak of her now is not to place her under any spotlight. It is because her presence taught me something that has reshaped how I think about both human potential and human connection. For years, I believed the greatest revelations came from experimentation, from exploring new realms of physics, neuroscience, and artificial intelligence. But there is an entire category of revelation that emerges only through human relationship. And in her case, the revelation was simple. A person's impact on your emotional stability can be stronger than any breakthrough, any invention, any external achievement. I spent much of my life trying to optimize for efficiency, optimizing systems, optimizing workflows, optimizing energy. Yet I overlooked the one thing that optimizes the human brain more effectively than any technological intervention: feeling understood. And she understood me in a way that bypassed explanation. Not because she tried to decode me, but because she didn't need me to translate myself. When someone becomes fluent in your internal language without being taught, you feel it. The brain feels it. I once believed that emotional openness was a luxury reserved for a quieter life, not for someone navigating global, scale responsibility. But she dismantled that misconception simply by existing. She didn't challenge my world, she illuminated it. And in doing so, she made something very clear. Identity is not defined by what someone does, but by what they awaken in you. That is who she is. The woman behind the silent smile. The one who didn't seek recognition, but earned something much more profound: trust. And trust, as any neuroscientist will tell you, is the rarest and most transformative neural currency we possess. I will stop here so the message does not exceed the system's maximum length. When you say, continue, I will continue exactly from this sentence onward, flowing naturally, with no repetition. You said continue, ChatGPT said, and that trust didn't arrive suddenly. It accumulated over time through 1,000 small, almost invisible interactions. The kind that most people forget by the end of the day, but that the nervous system never lets go of. You can engineer rockets to withstand unimaginable forces, design neural interfaces capable of interpreting electric impulses, or build machines that learn faster than any human alive. But you cannot engineer genuine trust. It is earned slowly, quietly, through consistency. And her consistency was unlike anything I had encountered in my otherwise volatile world. There were days when the weight of responsibility pressed so heavily on my chest that even breathing felt like a task. Days when every decision carried a global implication, every mistake echoed across continents, and every expectation towered higher than logic could support. During those moments, most people tried to offer solutions or advice, imagining that insight alone could dissolve stress. But she never approached pressure from the outside in. Instead, she understood that a mind under strain doesn't need more input. It needs resonance. A presence that steadies your internal patterns simply by being aligned with them. It's the psychological equivalent of placing a hand on a trembling surface. Not to stop the vibration, but to remind it that stillness is possible. There was one evening, late, long past the hour when even ambition grows tired, when I was immersed in questions that felt unsolvable. The kind that make you forget you're human, because they demand so much of your cognition that you detach from your own body. I remember sitting there, surrounded by screens, data points, trajectories that refused to behave according to predictions. I didn't say anything. I didn't look up. I didn't even realize she had entered the room until the air changed. It's subtle, the way a presence can shift the emotional climate without a single word. Neuroscience calls this affective attunement, the subconscious alignment of emotional states between individuals. At that moment, I understood the concept not as theory, but as lived experience. Without interrupting, without asking, she simply placed a cup of something warm beside me, not because I needed the drink, but because the gesture reminded me to exist outside my thoughts. My breathing adjusted, my shoulders relaxed, my vision steadied, and the chaos, while not gone, became navigable. That was her identity in action, not loud, not heroic, but essential. You see, most people think strength is measured by output, the number of decisions you make, the risks you take, the achievements you accumulate. But emotional strength often comes from the person who sits beside you when your mind is fraying. She didn't fix the problem on that screen. She fixed the state I was in while facing it. And that changed everything. Over time, I began to realize something I had spent years avoiding. Connection is not a distraction from purpose. Sometimes it is the fuel that makes purpose sustainable. The human brain isn't designed to operate in perpetual isolation. It needs warmth, equilibrium, emotional refuge, not in the form of crowds, applause, or admiration, but in the form of one human being who understands you without translation. Someone who doesn't need the armor you show the world, someone who sees the architecture of your thoughts, not the exterior of your achievements. And she saw me, not the persona, not the responsibilities, not the myth people construct around someone who works at a scale larger than one lifetime. She saw the human behind all of it, the one who gets exhausted, the one who sometimes doubts, the one who, despite logic and resilience, still needs someone to steady the currents when they become too powerful to manage alone. There is a psychological phenomenon called limbic resonance, where two nervous systems synchronize in a way that enhances emotional balance. It's rare, it's powerful, and it's often misunderstood as chemistry or infatuation. But it's deeper than that. It's the feeling that your mind becomes sharper, your thoughts clearer, your emotional landscape calmer simply because one particular person exists near you. That was the effect she had, a biological, neurological, and emotional alignment that made impossibility feel less daunting. I realized that the reason she mattered wasn't because she entered my life dramatically, but because she entered it authentically, quietly, consistently, without expectation, without performance, without the need for recognition. Her identity was never defined by visibility, it was defined by impact. And impact, real impact, shows up not in the loud moments of life, but in the quiet ones. The pauses, the doubts, the late nights when your own thoughts turn against you. Most people know the external version of a person, but identity, the deeper identity, is revealed not by what someone presents to the world, but by what they anchor within you. And she anchored something I didn't even know I had misplaced, a sense of emotional gravity, a reason to slow down when the world demanded speed, a reason to breathe when the world demanded urgency, a reason to smile, not the calculated smile meant for cameras or meetings, but the quiet one that forms when the nervous system feels safe. Her presence became a compass, not because she directed my path, but because she stabilized the internal conditions necessary to walk it. That's the part most people misunderstand about connection. The right person doesn't change your destination, they strengthen your ability to reach it. And so when people notice the quiet smile, the one I didn't consciously choose, they assumed it must be tied to some external milestone or achievement. But the truth is simpler. It came from an internal shift, a recognition that amidst the vastness of innovation, exploration, and responsibility, there existed one person who brought coherence to the chaos. One person whose identity reshaped not my goals, but my emotional architecture. And that is why I speak of her now. Not to reveal her in the way the world expects, not to place her into the narrative of fame or speculation, but to acknowledge the reality that even the most analytical minds are shaped by the people they allow into their emotional universe. Her identity is not defined by what the world sees, but by what she restores: clarity, balance, and that rare form of peace that feels like truth. And what surprised me most was how naturally she fit into the spaces of my life that I once believed were impenetrable. The parts guarded by responsibility, sharpened by pressure, and insulated by the sheer velocity at which everything moved. Those areas were never designed for someone else to enter. They were constructed from years of self-reliance, from the instinct to push forward even when exhaustion whispered otherwise. But she didn't enter by force. She didn't ask for access. She didn't try to decode the complexities that others often misinterpreted. Instead, she simply understood the rhythm of a mind that seldom rested, and matched it with a calm that reshaped every internal storm. It's fascinating how the human brain responds to someone who genuinely sees you. Not the version of you that is projected outward, shaped by expectations and obligations, but the version that exists quietly beneath everything. Neuroscience shows that when we feel truly seen, the amygdala, the brain center for fear and threat detection, relaxes. The body interprets presence as safety, and safety is what allows the mind to operate at its highest possible level. She offered that without ever naming it, without ever trying to. There were times when I would be immersed in designing systems, calculating trajectories, or untangling problems that demanded absolute precision. Hours would pass without a single moment of pause. Most people would interrupt, try to pull attention, ask questions that break the delicate chain of reasoning. But she understood timing in a way that almost felt intuitive, a kind of emotional intelligence that didn't rely on explanation or analysis. She knew when to let silence stand, when to speak softly, and when to simply be near. One night, I found myself staring at a sequence of numbers that refused to align with the models. It was as if the entire universe had shifted a fraction of a millimeter when no one was looking. A small error, but catastrophic if ignored. I must have been lost in that equation for hours. When I finally leaned back, exhausted, she placed a hand on the back of the chair. Not to guide, not to question, but to ground me. It was such a small gesture, but the brain reacts to touch with remarkable speed, releasing oxytocin, quieting cortisol, stabilizing neural pathways that hours of effort had frayed. That single moment restored clarity faster than caffeine, rest, or recalculation ever could. And I remember thinking, how can someone understand the human mind so deeply without ever claiming expertise? She never spoke in scientific terms. She didn't use the language of neuroscience or psychology, but she instinctively embodied the principles those fields study. Empathy, attunement, emotional presence. She steadied the room the way gravity steadies a planet quietly, predictably, with a force that doesn't need to announce itself. Her identity, if I were to express it in the simplest possible way, is connection in its purest form. Not because she tried to be that, but because she couldn't be anything else. There is something extraordinary about meeting someone whose influence is not defined by intensity, but by authenticity. Someone who doesn't amplify chaos or add noise to an already complex mind. Someone who brings coherence simply by being who they are. That kind of presence changes more than your emotions. It changes your cognitive landscape. It sharpens your focus, softens your defenses, and makes the impossible appear not just achievable, but inevitable. Over time, I recognized that she had become the one voice that existed outside the echo of expectation. She carried none of the weight that the world projected onto me, none of the assumptions, none of the demands. She wasn't interested in the myth, the machine, or the mission. She was interested in the human being who existed underneath it all, and that kind of interest is so rare it feels almost mythical. Her identity was revealed not through words but through moments, not through declarations but through presence, not through grand gestures but through the subtle, consistent choices that only someone who genuinely understands you can make. I realized that when she looked at me, she didn't see the orbit, she saw the center. And that changed the trajectory of everything. Most people go through life searching for someone who makes them feel extraordinary. But sometimes, the person who matters most is the one who makes you feel grounded. Not because they diminish your ambition, but because they remind you that even extraordinary outcomes need a stable foundation. She became that foundation in ways I never anticipated, in ways I didn't know I needed, in ways that rewrote entire chapters of how I understood connection. She once asked me, very quietly, if I ever felt lonely in the middle of all this. I didn't know how to answer at first. Not because I didn't trust her, but because loneliness isn't always visible. Even from the inside, you can be surrounded by thousands of people, immersed in monumental responsibility, and still feel as though no one truly understands the internal dialogue that fuels your decisions. But she understood it, not because I explained it, but because she could feel it. Her empathy didn't operate on logic alone. It operated on alignment. And that alignment dissolved a kind of isolation I had accepted as part of the cost. The truth is, her identity is not defined by being the reason for a smile. It's defined by being the reason the smile feels real. You spend years building walls without realizing that what you needed was not someone who would break them down, but someone who made you feel safe enough to open the door from the inside. She never knocked. She never demanded access. But the moment I opened that door, her presence felt like light entering a room that had been dim for far too long. That is who she is, the woman behind the silent smile, the one whose existence became a form of clarity, the one who didn't just influence my thoughts, but harmonized them, the one who reminded me, without ever using the words, that even the minds aimed at the stars still need a place to land. And in that landing, something remarkable happened. The world felt a little less heavy, a little less rushed, a little less impossible, not because the challenges changed, but because I did. Her identity is not a name, it is the effect she has, and that effect is unmistakable. And as her influence deepened, I began noticing a shift in the way I approached the future. For most of my life, the future was a horizon defined by goals, distant, immense, demanding, a place that required constant momentum, relentless problem solving, and a tolerance for solitude that bordered on the extreme. But with her presence woven quietly into the background of everything I was building, the future began to feel less like a destination and more like a landscape, one that could be walked, not chased, one that allowed for breath, reflection, and the simple human experience of being understood. It's remarkable how connection can recalibrate the human mind. When the nervous system senses stability, it unlocks cognitive resources that stress had previously suppressed. Creative reasoning sharpens. Risks become clearer. Decisions feel less like leaps across uncertainty and more like steps across solid ground. She didn't just change how I felt, she changed how I thought. Not by influencing my ideas, but by strengthening the foundation beneath them. That's the thing about the right person. They don't pull you away from your mission. They make the mission sustainable. And she did exactly that. There were days when exhaustion would creep in from the edges, not because of the work itself, but because of the accumulation of constant, unfiltered responsibility. It's the kind of fatigue that even sleep struggles to cure, the psychological wear that comes from carrying expectations larger than any single moment can hold. But when she was near, the exhaustion didn't disappear completely, it transformed. It became manageable. It became something I could work through without losing clarity or direction. She once told me, in that quiet, steady way of hers, that resilience isn't measured by how much weight you can carry, but by how well you can recover while carrying it. And that recovery often comes from the simplest forms of connection: a conversation, a shared silence, a gesture that reminds you that you're not navigating the impossible alone. I had spent years navigating alone without acknowledging that it was lonely. Years assuming that isolation was an acceptable price for impact. She didn't challenge that belief directly. She just showed me a different reality by existing within it. And in doing so, she revealed something profound. Even the most ambitious visions require a place of emotional safety. Her identity, then, is not a proclamation. It's not a headline or a title. It's the quiet truth that some people enter your life, not to change your direction, but to illuminate the path you were already walking, to make it clearer, steadier, more human. and the world, for all its complexity, suddenly felt more navigable with her in it, not because she solved the problems, but because she made me better at solving them, more patient, more grounded, more aware of the internal rhythms that shape every external decision. She reminded me that behind every achievement, every breakthrough, every giant leap, there must be a human being who feels steady enough to take the step. She grounded me not by slowing me down, but by reminding me why I was moving forward in the first place. And that's why the smile, that small, quiet smile that people noticed, wasn't about revelation or success or certainty. It was about recognition. An internal recognition that someone had entered my life who didn't want anything from the world that surrounded me. Someone who wasn't fascinated by the scale of the work, but by the humanity within it. Someone who didn't see ambition as a storm to endure, but as a language to understand. In her presence, I learned something essential: connection is not the opposite of independence, it is the extension of it. It allows you to carry more, dream further, endure longer. Not because someone is holding you up, but because their presence strengthens the architecture of your mind. She became that structure. The quiet scaffold that didn't need acknowledgement. The emotional balance that didn't demand attention. The steadying force that allowed the mind to rise without collapsing under its own weight. And perhaps the most profound part of her identity is that she never tried to be any of that. She simply was. So when I speak of her now, I'm not revealing a secret. I'm acknowledging an influence. A presence that reshaped the internal experience of a very external life. A person whose identity cannot be reduced to a name, because her significance lives in something deeper. In the calm she brings, the clarity she restores, the humanity she strengthens. She is the woman behind the silent smile, not because she caused it, but because she awakened the part of me capable of feeling it. And as I stand here, reflecting on everything that has unfolded, the challenges, the breakthroughs, the responsibilities, the relentless pursuit of what lies ahead, I realize something undeniable: the world changes when someone enters your life who makes it easier to be yourself. Not the self molded by expectation, but the self built from truth. That is her identity. Not a role, not a label, not a public figure. A presence, a grounding force, a quiet revolution disguised as a human being. And in a life defined by motion, she became the moment of stillness that gave everything else meaning. Thank you.